Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here. My name is John Mutchek. I'm a principal cloud solution architect in the health science business at Microsoft, as Ron said. I've been working in technology for almost 30 years. This is the 14th year at Microsoft. And during that time, I've spent a lot of time working companies, organizations as a developer and as an architect. Microsoft, I've spent most of that time focused on helping customers with their technology roadmap adopt the platforms and the technologies that Microsoft builds, but also get those in with their heterogeneous environments that they have today. Now, before we begin, I'd like to start with our mission. I know that many of you have heard this before. The Microsoft mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. I think that is, when we think about the context of this conversation, this is especially true for me in healthcare, in that we are, the idea is that if you give everybody, anybody really, the right tools, the right motivation, the right support, that they will have, they really have the ability to achieve anything. In healthcare, there is, a plethora of new tools. Our providers have this access to just an insane amount of capability that they've never had before. And it of course, comes with a lot of challenges to actually implement those things. So even before our pandemic that we're going through today, we had tough challenges in this system. We're dealing with aging population, provider burnout, and other problems. The COVID-19 pandemic has shined a big spotlight on some of those, and also brought its own right to bear. How do we do virtual health at scale? How do we accelerate research efforts? Not to mention the incredible sort of mental health challenges that are with us and ahead of us. And we look at this and say this is not something that any single healthcare provider or health network, a life sciences company, really should have to deal with on their own. In this industry, we do have to acknowledge the incredible sensitivity of the work that we're doing, of the data that we're entrusted with, but at the same time, we want organizations such as your own to collaborate in order to help advance the state of the art. We also have to understand that you compete on some levels, and in some cases directly, in some cases indirectly. So how do we enable a platform that allows you to stay distinct and compete with each other, but still also look for opportunities to share data in a way that is protected, but still advances the greater good? When we look at this set of challenges, unlike some industries, our problem is not that we have a lack of data, right? And I think you'd probably all agree we have a ridiculous amount of data in the healthcare industry. Some estimates show that a typical healthcare provider in the US is generating 50 petabytes of data. That's across more than 10 different systems where it's stored in the back end. And so the challenge is not that we don't have the data, it's that we have challenges integrating that data, putting it together in order to assign insights, in order to get increased value out of the relationships between those data. And on top of that, we've got new data coming in from Internet of Things devices, from labs, from hospitals, from research organizations, streaming it at increasing rates. And so how do we put all of that together in order to solve for this problem? Ultimately, Microsoft thinks that this is a system integration and optimization problem, right? That the right answer, the way forward, is to take a holistic approach, not to replace all of those systems that are on-prem today or that live in a cloud someplace today, but to find ways to unlock them and integrate them together more effectively. So with that goal in mind, a few years ago, we built on that mission that I mentioned to actively invest in the healthcare industry. As a platforms company, we look for ways to invest in a foundation that everybody can build upon, build specific solutions that meet the needs of their market. With our investment in healthcare, we are specifically looking to build that same type of a horizontal platform, but specifically tuned for the needs of healthcare organizations. At the center of this is always going to be the patient experience, right? How do we drive better patient outcomes? How do we engage the patient in a more productive and more satisfactory end-to-end experience? We want to help the care teams that are providing the patients those services on the front line. We want to help them to strike a better work-life balance, right? To be able to see more patients, to help more people, but at the same time not, to avoid that burnout that so many are feeling today. And organizationally, we know that in order to make any of this happen, IT organizations, technology decision makers, leaders within your companies need to have a platform that they can trust, that they have confidence in order to iterate at the kind of speed that modern requirements demand. And that means having a place where we know that we meet regulatory requirements, that we're protecting data properly, and that people have access to what they need only as much as they need when, at the time that they need it. So you may have heard of the Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare. This is the first of a few different initiatives that I want to talk about today. It was about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, that we first announced this as our first industry-specific cloud offering. Now, it's not a new monolithic application that you sort of choose to opt into or not, but it's actually a bunch of very carefully crafted features and capabilities that span across services that you are probably already using. We're focused on these three areas: enhancing patient engagement, working with the health team to empower better collaboration, and then on the back end, finding ways to better connect all of those disparate systems in order to drive more interesting, more productive clinical and operational insights. Behind the scenes, that looks something like this, right? And this is probably not a big surprise. It's going to be the services that you're already familiar with, you're probably already using in Azure, in the Power Platform, Microsoft 365, and Dynamics, and others. We, at the bottom of this slide, which you actually cannot see because of the subtitles. I can fix that. As I said, this is not a monolithic stack. This is only works as it provides integration points back into the systems that you already have on-prem. And so that means EMR systems, EHR, medical imaging systems. These all have a rich variety of data that you need in order to really develop that next piece of innovation in order to help the care providers and help the patients and those members in your health networks. And so the stack starts with data that largely exists today, though also integrates new data, maybe from Internet of Things or other lab equipment that's coming in. It ingests that data in through a standard format by providing interfaces through the new FHIR interoperability API standards, and then surfaces that data through these experiences that you're already familiar with. Let me put this back down at the bottom. Okay. We're building this on really decades of platform experience. To me, that means, one, we're going to ship horizontal systems, things that provide a foundation for partners and customers to work to build solutions on top of, right? So we focus on these three primary scenarios, but in a way that doesn't lock you into just these scenarios or just the scenarios that we've envisioned or dreamed. Two, we're going to build this in the open. We want to make sure that your investments in third parties, in open source tools and open source platforms, they really continue to be realized, and if anything, are magnified by the platform. And three, we want to make it extensible. So partners like UiPath, like Productive Edge, who's going to speak after me, can really help innovate with you at a much faster pace. I said I've been at Microsoft for about 14 years now. It's a great company to work for. It's actually been amazing to see the um, the way that Microsoft has taken on this investment specifically into healthcare industry. I think it's a mission that is easy to get behind, and I think that sentiment's probably shared by a lot of you, right? Many of you work for healthcare organizations. The idea that I can get out of bed in the morning, at least for the last year, walk across the hall into my office and have, feel like I'm having productive conversations with customers that are and actively helping to improve patients' lives, to improve that end-to-end experience is just a really powerful one. I live in Connecticut with my family, and when I was preparing this presentation this weekend, one of the things that struck me is this weekend we actually, my wife and I had the opportunity, we had our first vaccine shots. And, it made me reflect on the process that we followed. There were parts of the experience that went very smoothly, that went great. There were other parts that I would say were less than smooth. And while I don't know anything about the technology behind Connecticut's implementation, about the systems that had to talk to each other, it really did become apparent, even from the outside looking in, where some of these gaps exist. And when I looked at these scenarios that the Cloud for Healthcare seeks to target, it was interesting that I could actually see my own vaccination experience sort of fall out of this. Trying to determine my eligibility for the vaccine, taking into account any of our personal health history as to whether or not that would impact our eligibility, determining where the vaccine is being offered, how to get scheduled, what happens if I miss that appointment, who's going to follow up with me. In a broader sense, wondering, well, this experience that I'm going through, how does the results of my vaccination get fed back up into the broader ecosystem, such that the more research can be done, more effective solutions or more effective treatments can be developed, and so it really sort of hit home for me that as we look at these horizontal, kind of solutions, again, we're a platform company. That's what we're all about. And oftentimes in a talk like this, we end up sort of diving down into, let me talk about the different technologies that can to enable your user experiences, the things that you care about. And so we'll talk about, data analytics or data lake, or what can I do for data visualization or application hosting. And it gets very technical very quick. And I think what differentiates the Cloud for Healthcare for me is the focus on these end-to-end scenarios where we know that underneath the covers, all these technologies are required in order to move it forward. But really, it's Microsoft leaning into these individual specific scenarios in order to help make sure that that integration exists out of the box rather than something that you have to build. I think that makes it different. So I'm going to take, if we think about that wheel, I'm going to take just a few of these and give you some examples of how we're working with different customers. And the first one is virtual health. I think that's a good example. It's sort of the most obvious or most prevalent for many of us. I know I had my first virtual doctor's appointment in my life in the last year, not something that I really ever expected. But it is a critical end-to-end patient experience. And so while just establishing a video conference link between a provider, between a doctor and a patient is sort of table stakes, what we found very quickly is that actually, in order to integrate that experience into both the patient's and the doctor's workflow, we need more than that. We need more than a standalone video conference service. And certainly Microsoft Teams gives us the core, collaboration capabilities. But when we start to think about it in the context of things like the HealthBot, in order to manage that interaction before and after the visit, when we think about using Teams apps to integrate maybe through the API for Fire to external or to third-party EHR and our systems to surface patient data during that visit, it becomes much more powerful. And this is something that St. Luke's is one of many customers that has already been using this part of the Cloud for Health to deliver remote, telemedicine, virtual health visits and appointments to their patients, primarily because they knew that patients would be either unwilling or unable to visit the hospital during the pandemic. But one of the things that they've found as they've rolled the service out is that there's actually is a broader population of folks whose patient experience can be improved with the flexibility of a virtual health option. Now, virtual health and telemedicine is not a new thing. The pandemic did not invent it, but it certainly accelerated the deployment for a lot of customers. And we don't think that it's going to replace in-person visits by any stretch of the imagination. But again, that flexibility does help to service a population that potentially was underserviced. The second example I'm going to use turns a little bit inside, where we talk about how the Cloud for Health can help the caregiver team, right? That team that needs to collaborate across either within a hospital or across organizations in order to deliver the kind of health care advice, consultation, and treatment that they need. And so again, we turn to Teams for the real-time collaboration, but then also layer things in other Office 365 services as well as the Power Platform in order to surface everything that the care provider needs, everything that that team needs to know about a patient all in one place. This is, I think Northwell Health is a great example of this concept. They've worked with Microsoft and the Azure platform and the Cloud for Health to develop a chatbot that runs in Teams. She's called Nora, and this creates a conversational interface, a way to surface patient data either out of a back-end health record or even potentially up-to-date metrics coming from a device someplace on the floor, a medical device. And that way the whole team is on the same page in terms of the current state of the patient, history, plans, upcoming visits, that kind of thing, all through one collaborative environment. And I know I've been around here a little bit, but on the back end, I think that there's something to be said, just about that ability to take data from all sorts of data, whether they be structured or unstructured, and start to take advantage of some of those pre-built dashboards and reporting experience that is, again, targeted at the healthcare industry. And while it's, I think, easy to think about all of the petabytes and petabytes of data that we have in existing health record environments, as well as medical imaging, or not to speak of all of the petabytes associated with medical imaging, we also have, thinking about this new type of data that's coming in. In this case, a customer that is working on building a interface into Cloud for Health for this streaming data from IoT, from an IoT device. And it's one thing to think about this data streaming in so that the doctor can have visibility to how well the patient is doing with the device, how well the prescribed treatment is going, but to surface it back to the patient, maybe through a to give sort of time insight into how maybe in their own behavior could affect the effectiveness of the treatment in the end as well, is super powerful sort of closed loop kind of system that we want to see the benefits from IoT in this case. Okay, so that was 3 examples, I think, of where we're seeing these sort of horizontal end-to-end kind of solutions, end-to-end scenarios landing in the cloud for healthcare. And that was the first area that I wanted to talk about. I think that the next that I wanted to talk about was Azure as the platform that builds as both underneath that, as well as sort of lives on top of Cloud for Health, right? As Cloud for Health is a horizontal solution that's targeted at those end-to-end scenarios, we know that organizations have your own requirements. your own applications, your own workflows and scenarios that you need to build for and to meet. And Azure has really always been that place that customers go to innovate. And so you're familiar, I'm sure, with many of the services in Azure. Just like all cloud providers, there's a whole bunch of both infrastructure and platform services that you can use to build applications. I do want to sort of highlight today that there are an increasing selection of services in Azure that are, again, specifically targeted to the healthcare environment. Azure API for Fire, as an example, is a fully managed service for implementing the upcoming Fire requirements for interoperability REST API on top of health data. And it works by connecting to those on-prem EMRs and really any source of the where the health data lives today, and being able to ingest that into a standard format, which then can be queried and accessed by patients directly, by patient applications, or by partner organizations. I've already mentioned the HealthBot service. Text analytics for health, I think, is an interesting cognitive service that applies the grammars and the language associated with a medical conversation or a chat or note-taking in order to derive structure and context from unstructured language in the medical arena. So has awareness towards things like listing symptoms or treatments or patient information, capture that right out of the natural language and then use it in a structured form. Across these services, if we're going to talk about deploying to healthcare industry, we need to make sure that we meet those HIPAA and HITRUST certification requirements across the platform, across the cloud. That's no different for Azure. And in fact, we often will find ourselves exceeding those requirements as we seek to meet stringent requirements from other industries as well. And I think one that has come up actually in the past in working with healthcare companies is the US government's requirement for FedRAMP attestation. Actually sets quite a high bar in order to get FedRAMP high attestation. And in most clouds, that's something that you get in the US government version of their cloud. And that is true in Azure as well. But in the Azure commercial cloud, many, in fact, most of our services are also FedRAMP high certified. And so, it's always trying to maintain that secure baseline on the foundation so that as you build applications, you can take advantage of that going forward. I think it's also worth just pointing out that while we talk about security, privacy, and compliance, we don't want to forget about sort of the legal protections that Microsoft also provides to Azure enterprise customers around deploying your IP into a cloud environment, making sure that you continue to own and protect that IP, but also as you use open source software in the cloud, making sure that you're protected through indemnification as well as some patent sharing capabilities that we offer to Azure customers as well. So what do we see in healthcare across the investments that we see in customers doing in Azure? I think it's not surprising that they fall into these large categories. Internet of Things is a huge. AI and analytics is, no question, is on everybody's mind. The one that may be surprising is the mixed reality, which is something that I think has really been sort of just sitting under the surface for a couple of years now, and is really starting to emerge as a growth engine for a lot of companies. So I wanted to just go quickly through, let's see here. Yeah, so let me just jump quickly through some of the solutions that we have been working with other healthcare customers. And as I do, we're not going to go into the details of each of the implementations. I just want to give you an idea of some of the things that are going on. I think it's important to, I can't stress enough how important it is that These are big problems. They're big challenges that face the industry. It's one of the reasons why it's the first industry that Microsoft really leaned into and said we want to do that next level horizontal platform service. But it's a set of problems that we're really not going to be able to solve. Nobody's going to be able to solve on their own, right? And so the commitment to not just to open source and to open standards, but to solving these problems out in the open is super critical for Microsoft. I think it's part of what has really driven the conversation with many of our customers in this space. Let me jump to interesting. Okay. Let's see. So let's talk a little bit about these solutions. We're going to jump into a few AI scenarios here just in the last few minutes. And the first is around that patient experience. We'll start simply. We'll go back to the bot scenario, right? This is probably the most prevalent from an end user perspective use of our cognitive services and of our AI services running in Azure across industry. The AI required behind the scenes in order to do either voice transcription, translation, or communicate via a text channel or an SMS channel has been huge as we've tried to scale out sort of the conversation around the pandemic and educate as many people as possible. And this is precisely what the CDC has been using in order to deploy their bot services around the world in order to, again, to support the pandemic efforts. What we've seen for many of these organizations that have deployed bots in support of the pandemic response, that they have seen more and more use cases across their different departments where they're deploying bots more frequently now. They've seen the success that it's had with patients, that's increased patient engagement, that they're starting to use them elsewhere as well. So I think that has been a huge success. If we turn to the back office for a moment, and we refer back to sort of the UiPath conversation that we were just listening to, that AI has a huge role to play here as well. And what we've seen is for something as, maybe as mundane sounding as claims management and automation, there's the manual workflow components that we can drive a huge level of efficiency using like robotic process automation. And then there's also layering in the unstructured sources of data into those workflows as well. And so whether that be voice recordings from call center interactions, or handwritten notes, or scanned forms, that's actually what the NHS has been doing, is using this cognitive service for text recognition and form recognition in order to process handwritten prescriptions into their backend as structured data. And so again, it's this layering of solutions that ultimately gets us where we need to be. And I think one of the last ones I'll point out here is this example, which I think takes the cloud out to the edge. This is an example where we're deploying hardware, Azure hardware, out to an edge, maybe to a hospital or to a doctor's office, and then employing thermographic cameras in order to get real-time imagery from folks in a lobby or moving through a hallway in order to identify the potential fever existing in one of those individuals. And so we're sort of using the best of both worlds here, in that we're building and designing, we're training these AI models in order to use this infrared data to recognize even low-grade fevers in people as they just walk by a camera. But then we're packaging up that AI model and deploying it down to the edge right next to the camera so that we can get really near instantaneous readings and response to identify the individuals that might be already carrying a fever, so that we can take that data, integrate it back with with data from the health record, identify the individual, and take appropriate action from there forward. And so it's it's AI sort of born in the cloud, but then deployed down to the edge that helps sort of expand these solutions beyond the traditional sense of the cloud being a location that we want to or have to deploy into. So I know I'm, let's see, short on time, so I'm just going to mention two quick things here. And the first one I want to mention is that mixed reality topic that I brought up earlier. Many of you may have or might be familiar with the HoloLens. AR and VR has sort of seen a roller coaster of popularity and interest over the last couple of years in the consumer space. What's remarkable is that on the enterprise space, AR has really seen very strong and steady growth over the last few years. And I think part of that is because we're, again, very focused on end-to-end sort of user experiences. And in healthcare, we have been working with both providers as well as educators to find ways and experiment with ways to use the HoloLens to do things like visualize 3D CT scans for doctors and surgeons before moving into an operating theater to potentially reverse their actions there. And I think just in Build a few weeks ago, the keynote highlighted a use of HoloLens where they're experimentally using it to connect surgeons from operating in an operating theater out to experts around the world. And that first person point of view really helps them bring in multiple opinions and help get guidance and direction as they might execute on difficult or rare procedures. And the last area that I'll sort of highlight again across these different areas that I feel like Microsoft seeks to invest specifically in the healthcare arena, Cloud for Health, services built directly in Azure and AI, mixed reality, and now confidential computing here at the end. Confidential computing is a tech that builds on top of the specific extensions to both Intel and AMD's processor cores that allows you to run executable code and insert data at the compute level that is protected from all outside of it. And so in simple terms, this essentially means that if you run a process that iterates on some piece of data or does some calculation on a processor, that the administrator of the machine, the owner of that hardware, doesn't have access to the data as it lives in memory. And so in Azure today, both you can get a virtual machine or a container where the process that's running in that it's called a secure enclave, is not accessible to anybody except for you, including an Azure administrator. And so there are some really interesting scenarios in the healthcare space around, and one of them is around data sharing, that if we have one research organization that wants to build out, let's say, an AI model to do predictive diagnostics based on medical imaging, that model, as we all know, is only going to be as good as the amount of data that we can bring to it. And if we have multiple, if we have just one, let's say, source of data, one hospital that's willing to share their data with us, then we can do so much with it. But if we had 2 or 3 or more hospitals that would be willing to share their data and put them all into the same model, that model would be that much more accurate. But the challenge is that those hospitals, rightly so, are very protective of that data and want to be very careful that they don't release it in a way that it makes it available to any other providers or to anybody else. And confidential computing really gives us a model where we can, each of those individual hospitals or providers can have confidence that the data that they're sharing into the model will only be used to train that model and is not actually accessible by anybody else. And I think this is going to be a huge, really game changer for accelerating the development of some of this medical technology, if we can have this consistent platform where we can trust that that we actually don't need to trust the operator or the provider, that the data is safe, it remains ours, and we're doing the right thing as it's been entrusted to us by our patients. So that's it. I appreciate the time today. We like to say every company is a software company. I think we saw a bunch of good examples today that is definitely true in healthcare as well. As we work closely with you, we've seen that the most successful organizations are ones that don't think that digital transformation is just about adding technology, but supporting that core end-to-end experience, supporting the people that are trying to create value with that technology. I think it creates a common vision for healthcare that we share with our customers, that we're committed to the long game here. So again, I hope you enjoyed our last 30 minutes. Thank you, Ron. I really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody that is working so hard in this industry. I know it's critically important. I personally feel that it's critically important that we meet these challenges together.